It's probably become very clear at this point that I'm really into this computer metaphor. Minds are like computers. Minds do computations the same way that computers do. We can describe them in the same kinds of terms. But what if that metaphor was more than a metaphor? We as human beings are made of meat. In a sense, we are thinking machines made of meat. We are meat machines. Those are the terms that Andy Clark would use. We are meat that can think. So how is it that our bodies made of meat can generate complex thoughts, actions, desires, etc.? Well, we did address this earlier when we talked about the mind-body problem. Fundamentally, that's what we're talking about. How does meat generate thought? Are mind and body separate substances? Does one instantiate or cause the other? What's the causal connection between mind and body? Well, we talked before about Descartes and dualism. Descartes offered an argument in support of his version of dualism called the conceivability argument. He said, I can conceive that I, a thinking thing, exist without my extended body existing. Essentially, he's saying I can imagine existing without having a physical body. Then he says, anything I can conceive of is logically possible, because I wouldn't be able to imagine it if it wasn't at least possible. If it is logically possible for X to exist without Y, then X is not identical to Y. So that is that I, a thinking thing, am not identical with my extended body. The fact that I can imagine existing without my body means that me and my body cannot be exactly the same thing. They can't be identical. For Descartes, this proved that the mind and the body were separate things. The problem with that is that conceivability doesn't provably entail possibility. Just because I can imagine something doesn't mean that it must be so. The other theories that we've been looking at have been largely physicalist. Right? The behaviorists focus on the physical, atomic theory and identity theory are all physical. So one question for the dualist is, if the mind isn't the brain, then what exactly is it? And like we saw, I don't think that the dualists necessarily have a great answer to this question. We talked in the last video about different flavors of behaviorism. Methodological behaviorists just thought that science should focus on observable measures like behaviors. The mind is a black box. We can't see what's happening inside it, so let's just focus our energies on the things that we can observe. So this is kind of like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Shut up and calculate. Stop wasting time trying to figure out all this stuff that we can't measure or directly observe and just focus on the calculations we can actually do. Radical behaviors think, yeah, maybe internal mental states exist, but they're not very important. It's not super different from methodological behaviorism, but it's a little bit stronger. The analytic behaviorists made the strongest claims when they said mental states really are just behaviors. So if I say I want ice cream, that desire that I have for ice cream that I'm expressing, I would think of that as a mental state, the mental state of desiring ice cream. But really, that's just a way of talking about my pattern of behavior, the behavior of seeking out ice cream. So what I'm experiencing isn't a desire for ice cream. It's just the observation that when I say I would like ice cream, I move my body towards a freezer. So instead of there being this rich representation and content and computations, there's none of that. It's really just behavior. So the behavior's takeaway is that mental states maybe are just clusters of behavior. They're just observable behaviors that tend to associate with each other. So if we say that someone feels pain, that's just describing the set of behaviors that are associated with being in pain, like recoil, wincing, moving your body away from the thing that's damaging you. That's what it means to be in pain. Of course, there's an issue with that. Not everyone reacts the same way. The clusters of behavior are different for different people. Some people don't react at all. Some people are locked in and their bodies literally cannot react. They don't have any behaviors, and yet they're fully conscious. This is a thing that we only became aware of, I think, about the 1970s when we gained the ability to probe into people's minds using neuroimaging, and we realized these people are trapped inside their own bodies. They can't communicate with the outside world. They can't move their limbs or do anything. But they still feel pain. They still feel sensations. They still have thoughts and they have mental content. But there are no behaviors associated with them. Identity theory, on the other hand, treats mental states as identical to brain states. So philosophers like Place and Feigl and Smart would say the mind can be fully explained by activity in the brain because brain states are mental states. Mental states aren't even descriptions of other things. They're not a different kind of thing. They don't have different properties. They just literally are brain states. Like I've said before, this turns out to be a very common viewpoint shared by many, many people, especially people in the sciences. Of course, the cognitive scientists' answer to all of this is multiple realizability. If pain can be experienced by humans and animals and potentially maybe even artificial intelligence, then how can we say that mental states are equivalent or identical to brain states? Humans and animals, especially something like a human and an octopus, have extremely different kinds of brains, structurally very, very different. So in what sense could we be having the same brain states? Yet I think we still would want to say that we have the same kinds of mental states as other creatures. Octopus can feel pain just as well as we can. They react to pain the same way that we react to pain by removing themselves from danger. So why would we assume that they're not having some kind of internal experience that we think is like pain? So that's the claim of multiple realizability. The same mental state can be instantiated in multiple physical systems. Mental states can correspond to different physical configurations. You can have different systems, different configurations of matter that converge on the same kind of underlying mental state. And this could even extend to interpersonal variation, right? Our brains as individuals are quite different from each other. Maybe not as different as a human to an octopus, but we're not identical. There are always going to be small differences. So to describe a mental state as in terms of brain states, we won't even be able to say that two human beings are having the same mental state because two human beings may not have identical brain states. This is a problem for behaviorism because we know that people can experience mental states even if they're not able to express them behaviorally. Things like locked-in syndrome. And it's a problem for identity theory because if a mental state can be instantiated by more than one brain state, then they cannot be identical. Of course, this is all review. We already know all of this. Multiple realizability, functionalism. But it's leading into something in the context of the history of cognitive science. So I want to revisit functionalism. This is the foundational framework for cognitive science. We say mental states are defined by their functional profiles. This is contra behaviorism. Mental states can still be described as internal states. And contra to identity theory, mental states can be multiply realized. They don't have to be identical to specific configurations of brain matter. So mental states, in the David Marr terms, are going to be defined at that second algorithmic level. We can define what's happening in terms of representations and computations. How is information being represented, and how is that information being manipulated? That's what we're going to refer to when we talk about mental states. We're not referring to the physicality of the brain, and we're not referring to behavior, which is maybe an end result, a distal end result of a mental state. But we want to talk specifically about the information being processed in the mind at that moment. That's what we mean by mental state. So that's a lot of the background that was happening in the 20th century in philosophy and psychology that led up to and through the cognitive revolution, which we talked about in more detail in the last video. And a lot of cognitive science came about because of those empirical and philosophical movements. So these are very important movements in the history of cognitive science. But it leads us to our more modern framework, which is a variant of functionalism called computational theory of mind. And this is going to be what sort of ties this together for us, gives us a modern framework for thinking about computation in mental terms. This is a theory put forward by the philosopher Andy Clark. Computational theory of mind says the mind is an information processing computer. And it draws on work from philosophers like Putnam and Fodor and Rescorla. And this claim is maybe a little bit more bizarre than it sounds even at first. Like I said earlier, what if that computer metaphor, the mind being like software and the brain being like hardware and all that, what if that wasn't just a metaphor? What if that was literally true? In other words, maybe the mind really is, in a real sense, the software to the brain. The brain is just the meat stuff, the hardware, that executes the software, which is what we really care about. Those are the computations that the mind performs. Maybe the mind really is software. Maybe the brain really is literally a computer. This is the claim made by Andy Clark. Andy Clark says, it is that neural tissues, synapses, cell assemblies, and all the rest are just nature's rather wet and sticky way of building a hunk of honest-to-God computing machinery. Another way to put it is humans are wet computers. It's kind of gross, but it makes sense. We are just computers made of meat. We do the same kinds of things computers do. If we commit ourselves to functionalism, if we're going to define the reality of a mind in terms of its function, then we have to concede that we have about the same functionality as a classic computer. The brain is just evolution's way of doing computation capable of conscious thought. Mental properties are instantiated by physical properties, but they are not identical to physical properties. So the mind is a computer in a very literal sense. But then the question becomes, well, what type of computer is the mind? And what is computation? What counts as computation? So moving forward, we're going to be looking at properties of formal systems, and we're going to talk about ways that we can quantify computation itself. So we have a new mantra from Andy Clark. The mind is not like a computer. The mind is a computer. The mind is not like a computer. The mind is a computer. To understand computation, we have to understand formal systems. A classic example of a formal system is formal logic. If you've taken an introductory logic course, then this will be really familiar, right? Formal logic is what we call truth preserving. Logic preserves truth regardless of the meaning of the inputs. So you take something like modus ponens, P. If P, then Q. Therefore, Q. That specifies the valid form of an argument. If an argument has this form, it literally does not matter what the inputs are. It will always be valid. The validity of this argument does not depend on the truth of its inputs. The truth of the argument, the soundness of the argument may depend on the truth of its constituents. But the validity, the form, that will be true regardless. So there is a distinction to be drawn here between form and meaning, form and content, form and truth, right? Validity. An argument can be perfectly valid if it has the right form. It may be false if the premises lead you to a false conclusion, but it will have been a valid argument. Another example of formal systems are games. Games like Settlers of Catan. What makes a game a game? What makes this game Catan as opposed to another game? If I pull out all the components of this game, what does it have? It has a bunch of tiles with terrains on them. It has a little wooden token that represents a robber. It has dice. What makes it Catan? It's the rules. The rules are what make it the game. So games are formal systems in the sense that the implementation doesn't really matter. You can play chess with wood or marble or plastic or human beings if you play a version of lawn chess where you use people as pieces. It's still chess if you're doing the right computations, if you have the right rule set. It's the rules that matter. The rules of chess are very different than the rules of Catan. As long as you're playing with the right rule set, then you're playing the game. So the game is defined by the rules. It is a formal system. And again, there is a distinction between the form and the content. When you play Catan, you're settling an island and you're harvesting things like wheat and wool and wood, brick and all that. But all of that's kind of immaterial. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of the game. It doesn't matter what those things are. People who play games like this might refer to that as just like flavor or theme. But you can think about it also with that form and meaning distinction. There's sort of a form-content distinction. In Catan, I need wheat and wool and ore to build cities, but those could have been any arbitrary thing. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the rules. Here's one more example of a formal system. Language. Language is a formal system. Language has syntax. There's a formal structure to language. Sentences have to consist of words arranged in a specific order. And that order can vary from language to language. I think anybody who speaks more than one language, or anyone who studied a foreign language, like in high school or college, is very aware of the fact that languages have really different forms, very different structures. And there's this disconnect between form and meaning. Form can vary across languages. Languages have different rules for putting words in the right order. It's sort of like different games with different rule sets. Playing the game of English is different than playing the game of Japanese. But of course the meanings are the same in large part, mostly. The meanings are mostly the same, right? Of course, English has a word for dog, Japanese also has a word for dog. We have a word for eat in both languages. We have words for things like walking and talking and running and whatever else. Maybe there are different words that have slightly different connotations. Maybe some languages may combine words like eat and drink into a single word that means consume. Not every language has a word for dog, not every culture had dogs. But linguists believe that all languages are equally expressive. And what that means is that no matter what language you're speaking, you'll be able to convey any idea that you might have. No language has the ability to convey information that some other language doesn't have. So even if we don't have a specific word for a concept, like the feeling of being alone in a forest and how melancholy that is, which I think exists in Finnish, we can still talk about that concept. In fact, I just expressed it just now. I just had to use a lot more words to do so. So the meanings exist, but the forms are very different. So the structure of languages are very different. The rules are very different, just like the rules of different games are very different. So when we talk about the mind, we're really talking about computation. We're talking about the specific kinds of computations that are being done. And we're talking about formal systems. So thinking about mental computations in this way, as formal systems, will give us a really strong foothold and a way to quantify what we think is happening inside the mind. It'll give us a way of specifying very particular algorithms, very specific mental representations. And we're always going to be thinking about this in terms of information. Okay, in the next few lectures, we're going to talk about computational machines. So some approaches that take a very mathematical, quantifiable approach to thinking about how we can compute, how we can perform processes over information. So I want us to remember the mantra. The mind is an information processor that performs computations over representations. The mind is a computer. The only question is, what kind of computer? What kinds of computations does the mind perform? That's going to be, I think, our overarching question throughout this course. What kinds of computations does the mind perform? That's the ultimate question I think cognitive scientists are interested in. That's the question we want to answer. We need to be able to delineate and quantify the exact computations we think the mind is performing, the exact algorithms that are being executed, and the mental representations that those algorithms are operating over. Some key concepts today. We talked about identity theory, the idea that maybe mental states are identical to brain states. But of course, that's contrary to functionalism, which is sort of our foundational framework, which says that we are going to define mental states in terms of their functional profiles. Mental states are not identical to brain states, but they are instantiated by brain states. And the reason we believe in functionalism is because of multiple realizability. If mental states can be instantiated in multiple physical systems, then they cannot be identical to any particular physical state. We talked about the computational theory of mind, the philosophical approach offered by Andy Clark, where he says the mind is not like a computer. This isn't just a metaphor. The mind literally is a computer. So we're going to think about the mind in terms of computation. And one way to think about computation is in terms of formal systems. And so in the next lecture, we're going to talk more in depth about formal systems. Specifically, we're going to talk about computational machinery. And we're going to talk about the contribution of Alan Turing.